Thank you very much for joining today, everybody. We've got people that have signed up for the whole programme and people that have signed up just for today. So hopefully we can convince those that have just signed up for today that it would be good fun to join us all for the rest of the programme. For today, can I ask everybody, there's a few people that haven't muted yet. Could you mute yourselves for the talks, please? And because there's a lot of us, could we just stick any questions into the chat? But can you not put any thanks or comments that aren't questions in there? Otherwise, I won't be able to cope if there's a lot of questions with getting them all out. So today we've got three of us talking. I'll introduce myself first. I'm Jean Robson, and I'm managing this project. I seem to have an ability to keep saying, wouldn't this be a good idea? And the answer is always yes, you'd like to manage it, wouldn't you? So that's me. And I'm helped today by Mark Reeves, who those people in landscape will already know. Mark was one of the initial committee members when the landscape group started 10 years ago and remained on the committee until last year and was supposed to be having a rest now, but we've dragged him back. So thanks very much, Mark, for coming back today. And David Travis, who also will be familiar to a lot of landscape people as the coordinator of the circles, which is great. And David is helping quite a bit with this project in that he's doing two other talks and is going to be helping me with the peer support session. So thanks very much to David for your work as well. So just going on to the aims of the project. The project, we want to help and support you in developing a photo project over the next 18 months. But as well as that, we would like to build a community of people who help each other. And I believe that in photography, in amongst amateur photographers, there are two main groups of people. There seems to be a lot of people who come from a largely artistic background and are very good at the creative side, coming up with ideas, being creative with their photography, but their strengths aren't in organisation and technical side. And then there's people who come from a mainly scientific background, and they tend to be much better at the organisation, planning, technical side, and less good at coming up with creative ideas. So we're hoping that all of you will muck in and help each other, because we can certainly learn a lot from each other as we work through this. To facilitate that, we're going to have a private Facebook group for the project. So it would be great if you could engage with that. And we're also going to run peer support sessions. So as well as that, if you have any other suggestions of things that you'd like us to add in or that you could offer to help with, please let me know. So I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about what we're going to offer you over the next 18 months. And today is, sorry, I'll just start this. Today is World Earth Day. So I thought I would just start with giving you a few quotes from some of the world's most excellent conservation photographers. And the first one I picked, oh, sorry, I forgot to change me onto speaker view. Oh, never mind. Can you, no, sorry. Can you see my slides?
No, it was fine before you changed anything, Jean. It was we weren't seeing your notes, we were just seeing the slide. Now the screen's black.
I'm going to stop share. I don't know why that's happened, and share again. Sorry about that.
And now we're seeing your desktop. That's it. Now we're seeing just the slide.
That's fine. Okay. So the first one I was going to mention is Jim Brandenburg. He was a National Geographic contributing photographer, very well known. But as well as his commercial work, he did Nature 365 as a project, as a personal project. And it's probably the thing he's best known for. And what he said about that was that when one photographs the land we know, there may be nuance that is subconsciously embedded in the work, a form of spirit that comes from affection and intimate, long-term accumulated knowledge of the subject. I have often sensed my photographs are like visual prayer offerings, not unlike Tibetan prayer flags that are offered to the wind. Nature 365 has been an important expression of this, which I write about here. I have filmed or prayed nearly every day in places I have lived and known for years. So he certainly felt that he was doing a photograph or a video clip every day in a place that he was familiar with as a personal project. And he felt that there was something extra from that he wasn't getting in his commercial work. Oh, yeah, I don't know what's happening with it. All right. Uh, and then Sebastião Salgado, again, another person worth remembering on World Earth Day, said, I like very much to work on long-term projects. There is time for each photographer and the people in front of the camera to understand each other. There is time to go to a place and understand what is happening there. When you spend more time on a project, you learn to understand your subjects. There comes a time when it is not you who is taking the picture. Something special happens between the photographer and the people he is photographing. He realizes that they are giving the pictures to him. And I think you could easily just substitute subject from instead of people in his quotes. When you work fast, what you put into your pictures is what you brought with you, your own ideas and concepts. When you spend time on a project, you learn to understand your subjects. And he knew what he was doing in his project. He said, I don't want people to look at them and appreciate the light or the palette of tones. I want them to look inside and see what the pictures represent and the kind of people I photograph. And then somebody slightly more modern, Theo Bosboon from the Netherlands, was the winner of, I think it was the first NLPA projects competition, and he's subsequently gone on to judge the NLPA in the past. And he's very enthusiastic about projects and says, I feel my photographic horizon has been broadened, that's by projects. In addition, it gives me peace and focus. And he said, I I often wanted to do everything at once on a beautiful morning, landscape, wildlife, macro, but now I can focus and limit myself better, and that generally produces more compelling images. And then he also quite enjoys the fun and the challenges that working on the project in areas not actually taking the photographs brings. So he said coming up and working on themes, doing research on subjects and areas, and writing accompanying texts, selecting series from the available images, and presenting the final results. You can put a lot of yourself into this and make it very personal. So the three of them are all saying that they feel that by doing projects, they can produce much more meaningful, much more personal images, which I thought was nice, and it was worth celebrating those three people on World Earth Day. So from our project, what are we doing? So the dictionary definition of a project is an individual or collaborative enterprise that is carefully planned to achieve a particular aim. Well, that's obviously far too tight for us, so we'll bin that and have the definition that it's any body of work where there is reflection on the work as it progresses, and it involves, we would like it to involve some element of landscape photography. So it could be that it's a place that you want to photograph. It could be an event. It could be making a book. It could be making an AV. It could be learning a new piece of equipment. Anything at all. You could do a 365-day project, the same as Jim Brandenburg. Anything that involves doing some work, reflecting on it, learning from it, and developing something. So Mark's going to talk about why we think that working in projects, well, David and Mark and myself think working in projects is great. But I just thought I would list a few of the reasons, because that tells you why we thought that offering a project would be worthwhile. So it gives structure and purpose to your photography. It helps you develop skills and knowledge. It helps you to develop storytelling abilities. It avoids getting frustrated with your photography. It helps you make most of opportunities. And it makes you actually go out when it's wet and cold and horrible. It's much easier to go out if you're going out to do something constructive. But, oops, but there are lots of challenges with projects, and that's what we want to address in the projects project. So initially, coming up with ideas is sometimes difficult, and we've got ideas for you about how you can come up with projects. That's going to be included in a little bit in David's talk today. That will also be mentioned in Rob's talk in May and in the creativity talk later on in the year. So lots of ways of coming up with ideas. Projects tend to breed projects. I've always got on my computer folders for different projects, and some put away to be started later. So we've got ideas about how to manage that, which fits in with organising your work, and that's going to be covered. Projects are time consuming, but as they're fun, it doesn't matter. Identifying solutions can be a problem. So if you find that you want to photograph something and you're not sure how to do it, or you need an innovative solution for how to illustrate that, then we've got ways that we can help with perhaps thinking about different ways to come up with solutions. Learning new skills. We will be adding some talks at a later stage about solutions and output. So we may well have talks on book design, on AVs. It depends what outputs you want. So there's no point in us putting on a book design course if nobody's doing a book. So it will be up to you to ask us and tell us what you need in the way of outputs and learning skills. And of course, you're always coming up with something that you can buy, aren't you? So people have been asking me a few questions. Do you need to have a project idea now? Absolutely not. We're going to give you lots of ideas about how you might come up with a project to do. Do you have to have an output in mind? No, again, absolutely not. It's very common to start a project and not know where it's going to end up. But usually, as things develop, it becomes obvious that it needs to be a book or an AV or an exhibition or a photo essay, or what you want to do with it. So absolutely don't need to worry if you don't know what you're going to do with your project in the end at the moment. Does it need to be all landscape? Definitely not. And a photo essay or a project about a place may well need to have people, wildlife in it. You may need to have double exposures. You may need to have composites. It's what you need to tell your story. But it does, we would like it if it had a bit of landscape, as this is a landscape SIG, but absolutely not need to all be landscape photography. And can you change your mind mid-program? Yes, definitely you can, and that may well be very appropriate. So if you opt to do a 365 project, you may well get some of the way through and find that you're really, really interested in something that you've been photographing as part of that, and therefore it might change. You might decide to photograph, say, a nature reserve which has got some prehistoric archaeological remains in it, and get very interested in that, and it might progress into being a project about illustrating the prehistoric remains in your region. So it's absolutely okay to change your mind mid program. It's about you constructively doing what you want to do. So what's the plan? The sign up for to be part of the project needs to be done by the end of May. We've got the first talk on the 27th of May, and so everybody needs to be signed up at least 24 hours before that so that we can send you out the information. We have a series of talks, all of which will be recorded, and you will have access to all the recordings. So we start with Rob Knight. He's a professional photographer, educator. I think he's been an Adobe educator. He runs or has run workshops on projects. And interestingly, he runs workshops on projects, for photographic projects for the NHS as a sort of therapeutic, stress relieving type occupation. So that will be, and he will give us an overview. And then we've got talks by Astrid Pratt, Susie Bray, and Keith Walker on self-expression. So they're of the more artistic bent, and they will be talking about the sort of things that they do and coming up with ideas. And then we've got how can project management tools help? So Lee Foster, as well as being a photographer, has a background in project management, and he's talking, and David Travis is again talking about some of the tools that he uses. So that will be interesting too. And then we've got Saskia Coulson talking about vision and voice. Saskia comes from an illustrious family of photographers. Both her parents were Nat Geo staff photographers, and she now runs a photography company with her husband, and she's a fantastic photographer, and she's going to be talking about artist statements and storytelling. They have won some awards for their AVs from their still images, which I hope she's going to show us, and they're absolutely fantastic. And those are the ones that we've got dates for so far. Later in the year, we've got a talk on getting stuck, but we haven't pinned a date down for that. And as I say, we'll have talks on outputs once we get a bit farther and know what you want. We've got the private Facebook group, so even if you don't use Facebook a lot, it would be great if you could sign up to the group, and we hope to use it for asking questions of each other and sharing any project-related information that comes our way. We did that in the Books and Zines group as a digital imaging project, and it worked really well for sharing information. We'll have peer support sessions or circles later in the year where we can all come along and discuss how we're getting on with our projects, what we're having difficulty with, and get help from pals. And it's really nice that Joe Cornish has agreed to offer commentary at a final sharing event at the end of the project. So we'll be inviting members of the project to show us what they've been doing and show us their output, and Joe will give some positive and gentle feedback. So that will be good. In terms of sharing the recordings and links, once we get the first meeting underway, you will get a link to a Google Drive folder where we'll keep the links to all the recordings and the links to all the sessions, and if any of the speakers offer handouts, they will all be in there. So any information relevant to the project will be in one place. So when you get your link to it, please keep it. So that's really all I was going to say about how it's going to work. And now I'm going to hand over to Mark, who's going to talk about why he likes working in projects. And following that, we'll have David talking about where he gets ideas from. Okay.
Thank you, Jean. You've obviously done an impressive bit of project planning already. Right, so let me share my screen.
Just before Mark starts, Jean, there was a question from Neil Purcell, and he said he thought he was already signed up. If not, how does he do so?
If he got 2 emails from me yesterday, he will be already signed up. So one email was to people who just signed up for uh, um, the introductory, and the second was to people who signed up for the whole program. And I couldn't go through them all, matching them all, so I just sent both to the people that had signed up for both. If you have checked that and you don't know, have a look in your emails from Boleto, and if you're still not sure, give me an email. Okay.
Okay, shall I go on?
Did I spell? Somebody said Bossboom. Did I spell Theo's name wrong?
Yeah, you had an N on it, and it should
Don't
have
know.
M.
Quite possibly typo. Sorry. Okay, carry on, Mark.
Okie dokie. So thank you, Jean. Jean invited me to give this brief talk very much from a personal perspective, really, about why I enjoy working in projects. So that's what it is. It's a personal perspective. Different people may have different views, different experiences, and so on. But that's great. That's the diversity of what we do, isn't it? So I have become a big fan of working in projects over recent years. But going back just a few years, it wasn't something I did. I used to work mainly in natural environments, and so my photography typically revolved around a few trips or workshops each year in parts of Britain or maybe elsewhere that I thought would be interesting to photograph. And yeah, I'd come back with loads of images, some worth keeping, plenty that weren't. And soon I found I started to get a bit bored with turning out hundreds of landscape images, but with no real purpose in mind. And then it started to change in 2018 when I was commissioned by a property management company to make a couple of enormous photographic installations depicting notable buildings in Birmingham city centre. And so this was the first time that I'd really embarked on a true project. And when I started the assignment, it was fantastic. I mean, I loved it. To complete the project, I needed to come up with a concept and agree the details with the client, and then check out its feasibility, take all the images, and then process them into these 2 20-meter long collages. And I just loved doing it. A year later, in 2019, I embarked on working for an associateship of the Society. And of course, applying for a distinction could be seen as being a project. Applying for licensure kind of often involves trawling through a catalogue of existing images and looking for those that have sufficient technical competence and photographic diversity to meet the standard. So perhaps not a project in the way that we might think of it, but when we get to the associateship, well, that approach really doesn't work very often because there has to be a deliberate coherence in the panel of images, and that requires thoughtful planning and usually taking specific images in order to complete the panel. So essentially, it is a project. It requires conception, planning, execution, review and consideration, and completion. And again, I found the process really enjoyable, not just creating the images, but also the thought process that needed to go behind the work. Another year later, in 2020, while I was events manager for the landscape group, the pandemic came along, of course, and put the cat amongst the pigeons as regards our regular events program. And at that time, all our events were taking place face to face. And of course, many of them could no longer go ahead despite being outdoors. So I figured that there must be a way to have a program that could still go ahead, provide learning and enjoyment for our members, whilst not risking anyone's health or breaking the lockdown rules. Our professional event leaders took a bit of persuading, but most of them kind of came on board and agreed to give it a try. So Mark Banks and I came up with the idea of a series of projects in which Mark set a topic and gave an introductory Zoom talk about it. And then participants would go off and do the project. And then after a few weeks, come back together on Zoom to share the results and to receive feedback. As part of my role as being events manager and evaluating the idea, I took part in one of the projects which Mark ran. It was the one called Inclement, which required us to go out and deliberately take photographs in the kind of weather that we would often try and avoid if at all possible. The COVID restrictions meant that we were working close to home, and so working literally on my doorstep, I ventured out and found that I was able to create images with mood and atmosphere that I would never have done if I hadn't had to go out in the rain to take pictures, because I was involved in this project. So why did I enjoy the projects? Well, if we think about the things that we struggle with as photographers, obviously we have to master the technicalities of producing competent images and the more elusive art of compelling compositions. But beyond these, I think a lot of the challenges and barriers that we face are much more psychological. Firstly, there's motivation. I mean, there are, of course, plenty of times when we might be motivated by excitement. For example, the excitement of going somewhere new, or the excitement of some fantastic but fleeting weather or light conditions. But these don't happen most of the time. Most of the time we're at home and the weather isn't doing anything special. So that's not going to get us off our bums and out with our cameras. But if you're working on a project, well, then there's always a reason to work on your photography. And then we have direction. When we work on a project, we have a purpose, which again is usually highly motivational. We can no longer say to ourselves, I'd like to go out with my camera, but I don't know what to go and photograph, because a project overcomes that dilemma for us. And of course, that purpose could be anything. As Jean said, she gave examples. I mean, it could be to achieve a distinction, or it might be to document a local habitat as it changes throughout the year. It could be photographing my village or town or neighborhood after dark, or making postcards to sell in a local bookshop. Most projects, of course, have a defined outcome, even if that's not clear right from the outset. But as it goes through, that becomes clearer. And therefore there's a set of rules or guidelines that I don't mean written formal stuff, but just things that we need to follow in order to achieve the project's purpose. So to document a local habitat, well, then we can obviously photograph only at that location. If we want to photograph our town or village after dark, well, then that means we have to photograph in a particular place and at a particular time of day. Or to make postcards that we might want to sell, well, then we have to take appealing images that postcard buyers will want to buy. Effectively, these requirements place constraints on what we can do in pursuit of the project. And constraints can be all sorts. They might be the type of weather or the location or particular focal length or using a pinhole or photographing in infrared, so on and so on. And they're usually entirely of our own choice, unless of course we're being commissioned to do something for somebody else. But because of these constraints, we're often having to think about how can we achieve what we're trying to do effectively with like one hand tied behind our backs. And that, I think, is a huge driver of innovation and creativity. If we want to make postcards where we live, for example, then we have to look quite hard at the places that we usually would pass by without a glance in order to find appealing scenes. And so these restrictions lead to inspiration. And they make us work harder for our images. And I think that helps us to improve. Anyone can go and stand in a honeypot location in great conditions and open the shutter, but we won't learn much from doing that. Working with constraints really helps us to learn, in my opinion, my experience. So, for example, I'm working on a project for which I needed to photograph one of the tidal islands that are about a mile offshore from my home. And it's a location that has been painted repeatedly by local artists and photographed many times by local and visiting photographers. So I had to think quite hard about how to do something different. Eventually, I came up with the idea of standing in the water in an incoming tide and photographing with the camera held just a few centimeters above the water. I was very pleased with the resulting image, but it's something I would never have thought about if it wasn't for the project. Another example is this wonderful picture by Anne Miles, which was submitted as part of our By Degrees project. For those who are unfamiliar, By Degrees was a project that we ran with the Landscape Group a few years ago that required members to photograph the precise points where lines of latitude and longitude intersect. This location that Anne photographed is in the sort of flat agricultural lands of Lincolnshire. And she found a way through clever composition and choice of viewpoint to make a very successful image from a scene that most landscape photographers would never give a second glance to. And finally, I find that projects can give enormous satisfaction. This can come from either finishing a project, and let's face it, who doesn't enjoy the feeling of a job well done, or making progress on an ongoing project. We might, for example, embark on creating a book of images on a certain theme or location, and something like that will almost certainly take a while to complete. And when that last image is done and put to bed, well, then that's very satisfying. But actually, I don't think we even have to finish a project to feel satisfaction and achievement. Like many photographers, I have a website with images arranged under certain themes. The website will never be formally finished because it's continually evolving and being updated as I add new images and new pages. So creating new images that can add to this ongoing, never finished project can be just as satisfying as making the last one to go in the book, for example. And certainly much more satisfying than creating images that I think of as so what images. So this image here, for example, I mean, I really like it, but it doesn't fit into any other body of work that I've got. So it's like, well, so what? There's a degree of satisfaction in creating the individual image, but I've got nothing much I can do with it. Maybe sometime I'll start a project on suburban scenes after dark, but that's for the future, perhaps. And then the other thing about projects is that some kinds of images often work much better as a panel or as a collection than they do as standalone images. The whole can often be greater than the sum of the parts. So a project can be many things. And some of these I have done myself: a book, a zine, an exhibition, a website, series of prints, calendar, postcards, an audiovisual sequence, distinctions panel, and so on. And we can undertake them by ourselves, or they can be collaborative. So, like, for example, some of the collaborative projects that we've run through the Landscape Group, we had By Degrees and the Shipping Forecast and Postcards from Home. and so on. And of course, we don't only have to work on one project at a time. I've got a good friend who's always working on at least 4 or 5 projects simultaneously, and it means he can work on whichever one suits his location or the weather on the day that he feels like doing something. Whatever the variables are, there's always one of his projects will fit. And finally, I think projects can help to build your reputation as a serious photographer rather than as a kind of random snap shooter. If we think about some of the well-known photographers who became well-known because of their projects. So Mandy Barker with her wonderful series on ocean plastic, and Rachel Talabart's Sirens project, and Martin Parr with his Last Resort, and Bernd and Hiller Becker's typologies, in which they documented various types of industrial structures. So there we have it. To summarize, I would say I enjoy working in projects because it provides me with motivation, it gives me direction, it gives me inspiration sometimes, it certainly can help with innovation, it contributes to my learning. And I think for me, that's a very big thing. You know, I mean, I think a lot of I like to think that I've got some skills around composition, and I think a lot of that has come from working with constraints, working with difficult locations because of working on a particular project. But most importantly, it's about satisfaction, and that's why I do it. That's why I enjoy it, and I hope those of you who take part in the project will have a similar enjoyment. Where's my mouse gone? I'm trying to stop sharing, can't find my mouse. There we go. You're muted, Jean.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was great and nicely summarised. There's a few general questions come up, which we'll come to in a minute, but has anybody got any specific questions for Mark on his, if you would like to fire them in the chat, or if you can't get it into chat, just unmute yourself and ask. While you're thinking about that, there's a few people seem to not know whether they have booked into the full project. So it would take me ages to go through the lists and match them. So I would suggest that if you aren't sure, if you've paid £15 if you're in landscape, or more if you're not, you have definitely booked into the whole project. If you otherwise, if you're not sure whether you've paid or not, you need to look at your emails back, because as soon as you booked it, you will have had an email to say thank you for booking. If you haven't got that, or you're still not sure, if you email me, I will check. But I can't go through the list and email you all to tell you who's booked what. So if you're not sure, just email me and I can check for you. The other question that came up was, will support be given for distinctions as part of this? We're not aligned to the distinctions department, and the distinctions are changing. So we are not specifically giving any advice for distinctions, although doing a project may well result in a distinction. So we would advise you to go for an advisory day or a one-to-one if you think your project is heading that way. So if there's no other questions for Mark, can we get Dave to start his section? Oh, he's there.
Okay. Let me just minify that. Well, it won't be as swish as Mark. So how does he do that thing with the video and it on Zoom, and it kind of transitions to slides?
I'll tell you afterwards. I only found out about it yesterday.
Fantastic. So in this section, I'll be talking about where project ideas come from. And Jean mentioned the different outputs from a project. Now, I like doing books and creating other kinds of output, but every project that I work on starts life as an article on my website. Now, most photographers have a website to show a portfolio of their images, like Mark was describing, and I think that makes sense if you're a pro or you're someone who sells print, but I'm neither. So I wanted to create a website that would be project-based rather than portfolio-based. And initially, I wrote up a project every 3 months or so, but for the last 2 to 3 years, I've written about a new project every month. Now, you're probably thinking, these can't be very good projects if I can polish them off in a month. But that's not the point. Linus Pauling, who received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1954, he was once asked, how do you go about having good ideas? And his answer was, the best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas. And in order to make sure I have a new project idea on hand, I make a clipping every time I come across something I find interesting. These might be taken from a magazine or a web page. It might be an image from Instagram or just something that occurred to me when out on a walk. And I use Notion to store these ideas, but any system will do, even a paper scrapbook. And I've clipped over 200 ideas here. And some of them are a bit like monkey tennis. If you've watched Alan Partridge, you'll know what I mean. Some of the ideas are a bit desperate, but it's really about quantity, not quality. And behind each of these tiles is a note I've made or a photograph I've clipped. And I try to surface one idea a day. And every now and again, I'll go through them for inspiration. And I turn the best ones into a project. So this is a screenshot from my website. There are about 50 projects here. And for this talk, I decided to categorize them to see where the idea for each project came from. And it seemed to me they came from a challenge or a criticism of my photography, a personal contact like a friend, an item of photography gear that I own, someone else's idea that inspired me. It might have been a local landscape or travel, both in this country and abroad, or it was a workshop I attended, or it was combining project ideas, kind of mashing them together to create something new. And this particular project on woodland came from a challenge. So I'm not a woodland photographer. Now, of course, I've taken photographs of trees and I've taken photographs in the woods, but I can't say I've ever done it with anything other than a kind of artlessness. I've always struggled with the complexity of woodland scenes, of chaos of overlapping branches, and the general mess of it all. So one autumn, I made a conscious decision to improve my woodland photography. I went out on several woodland trips in and around the Peak District, which is where I live, and I attended a couple of landscape group events on woodland photography. I viewed loads of tutorials on YouTube. I spent time looking at the images from woodland photographers that I admire. And I'm telling you this because when we think about projects, we tend to think of doing a project on something we're good at. So we make a list of our specialist subjects and then we pick one for our photography. But what if you look through the other end of the telescope? What's something you aren't good at, but you want to improve on? Can you make that your project? And talking of getting better at something, this next project arose from a criticism of my photography. When I first joined my local photographic club, my weak spot was natural history. Now, that didn't stop me from entering, of course. In fact, I thought I was okay at natural history. Not great, but okay. And then I entered this photograph of a woodpecker on a feeder in my garden, and the judge said 4 words: hand of man, next. So I decided to work at my backyard bird photography. And each of these images was taken from my back door. I created different perches and spent time improving. So the top left image shows a woodpecker on some driftwood I found. No hand of man there, even though it was literally a metre from where I took the other picture. The next one along shows a goldfinch pulling sheep's wool from some barbed wire. I found the sheep's wool on a walk and I stretched some barbed wire between 2 posts. You can see one of the posts on the third image. And the bottom left image shows a long-tailed tit on a stick I found with off-cup fungus. And then we have a very tired-looking parent feeding a youngster. And the final image on the right shows a blue tit on a tiny patch of grass that I dug up in my garden. It's not much more than 1/2 metre square, and I set it up to look like a found still life. And I was motivated to do this project because of the criticism I'd received. So if criticism motivates you, then that might be another route in to a project idea. And this project came from a personal contact. So these photographs show a neighbour of mine who runs an apiary. I thought this would make a good photography project, so I asked him if I could go down for an hour or so to take some photographs. And what I enjoyed about this project was that I didn't really know what to expect. I knew nothing about beekeeping. But an hour or so later, I understood the way the hives worked, why they use smoke to calm the bees, what the queen does and why that's important, and so on. So although this was a photography project, it had additional intrinsic interest that went beyond photography. The point is, each of us has got unique access to something. Maybe you can get access to a building or a workshop because of your job or your previous job, or maybe you know someone who keeps racing pigeons, or you know someone in the local rugby or football club that can get you an access all areas pass. And at the very least, you can approach people in your family or neighbours in the street where you live. And it's worth asking the question, what can I get access to, but other people wouldn't be able to get that access so easily? Because that's an opportunity for you to get images that are going to be distinctive. Now, this project idea also came from a personal contact. There are some genres of photography that I never really felt drawn to, and one of these is aviation photography. It used to strike me as a bit like train spotting or stamp collecting, but I'm always open to try my hand at photographing new things. So when a friend suggested we go to an air show, I decided to give it a try. And I returned from the air show with pictures like this that were good technically, but I thought they lacked emotion. Yeah, flying in these jets, it must be an amazing experience. The pilots are incredibly talented, they're incredibly brave, but I didn't get that feeling from my airshow images. They kind of lacked romance. And that got me thinking, if I could photograph these aircraft in any location, where would I choose? And I looked through some of my more mountainous landscape photographs and I found some suitable backgrounds. And then I composited my photographs of jets and planes onto those backgrounds. And these images literally provide a different perspective. Although I took the photographs looking up from the ground, when I composited the planes onto these different landscapes, it's as if you're up in the air too, photographing from another plane. So sometimes just going out and taking photographs, even of something you're not that interested in, can lead to a new project idea. And this project idea came from a piece of equipment. So I'm sure you've read dozens of articles where a photographer says, it's not about the gear. Well, let's turn that on its head. Let's make it about the gear and see if that gives us some inspiration. So a few things mark the start of spring like we're in at the moment, quite like dusting off the infrared camera. So when the trees are in leaf, when the sun's a bit too harsh for conventional photography, I realised that it's time to try that otherworldly black and white infrared look. And Mark mentioned being inspired by giving yourself constraints. So what gear constraints could you use for your next projects? If you don't have an infrared camera, you could just try shooting landscapes in mono and see where it leads. And here's another project that came from a piece of equipment. These photographs were taken with a pinhole camera. So a pinhole camera is about as far from a modern camera as you can possibly get. It's essentially a light, tight box of air. There's no lens, just a hole at one end of the box and a sheet of film at the other. There's no exposure meter, no viewfinder. There's not even a shutter. It represents the antithesis of contemporary photographic technology. And I was astonished at the end result. These didn't look like the pinhole photographs I'd seen in the past. When I took the photograph of the boat on the bottom left, for example, I never thought I'd be able to read the text. And the same with the sign in the bottom middle image. And this was one of those projects where the process was as much fun as the end result. When I was using a large format film and I wanted to develop it myself, I made mistakes, I learned new techniques, I got better at identifying scenes that would work well in black and white. And these skills are transferable skills to my digital photography. So is there a piece of gear you can use to inspire your next project? And inspiration from other photographers is another source of ideas. So I've been interested in portraiture since I started photography, but I quickly found that I don't enjoy taking straight studio portraits. I'm far more drawn to the kind of expressive portraits made by photographers like Sarah Moon, Francesca Woodman, and Victor Skrebneski, where the subject's blurred and the viewer's left to do some work interpreting the image. And I think I'm drawn to this style because it's an antidote to how I usually work. So my normal approach to photography is precise and controlled. I feel like a cook who always follows the recipe and weighs every ingredient. And sometimes I just want to ignore the recipe, trust my instincts, and see what happens when I chuck it all in the pan. And this project came from pursuing that idea. So these images started life as straight portraits, but then I used Photoshop to make them more expressive. So what kinds of photographs or photographers inspire you, and which ones are very different to your natural or your preferred style, and might following that path lead to a new project idea? And here's another project based on inspiration. So earlier this month, a local pottery museum put on a steampunk event, and I went along to take some portraits of people in their costumes. And I remembered a treatment I'd used many years ago where I took 3 panoramic images of a person, head, torso, and feet, and then combined them into a kind of collage. And in a single image, your eye goes straight to the face, but by showing 3 separate images, the viewer kind of has to look 3 times. And here I was inspired by myself, by an earlier idea that I hadn't fully pursued. So did you try a technique in the past, but then give up on it? Maybe it was a good idea, but you just need to apply it in a different context, like I did here. And your local environment is another source of inspiration for a project. I took these images at Wyming Brook in the Peak District. And on this day, with the autumn colour and the mist veiling the trees, it was spectacular. I spent a good 4 hours there, although it kind of whizzed by. So is there a location close to you that you could explore for a project? And how might you tell the story of that place? And sometimes I find it useful to give myself the conceit of imagining that a magazine editor has commissioned me to photograph the location. So I imagine I'm working on it for National Geographic or Outdoor Photography. And that helps me step back and think about the images I'll need to tell the story. And it stops me thinking about taking just one blockbuster image. And instead it makes me think about a series. And here's another project based on a local landscape. There's a disused quarry about 40 minutes from my home that hosts a good range of dragonfly and damselfly species. I visited 3 times over a few weeks. It was very challenging photography to do, but lots of fun. Oh, and by the way, you'll notice that these projects I'm showing you contain just 6 images, and that's deliberate. I think that 6 is enough to explore a theme with some depth, but it's small enough that it stays playful and low stakes. And I sometimes create more than 6 images, but 6 is my baseline, because aiming for just 6 images lets me try out ideas. It lets me fail quickly. If something doesn't work, I've only wasted 6 images, and I might be able to repurpose them later anyway. And it also avoids paralysis. A collection of 6 images is easier to finish and to publish. And if you're city-based, then there's always street photography. So here I gave myself the challenge of doing street photography, but with a constraint. I wanted to include a reflection in every image. And as Mark said, we think of constraints as making life harder for ourselves, but in fact, they can make us more creative because they force us to look deeper. So what constraints could you give yourself for your next project? How about one focal length, or square format, or phone camera only, or photograph while sitting, and so on and so on and so on. And those constraints will make the images look more like a curated set of work. And here's another urban project, architecture. I feel a bit embarrassed showing these after Mark showed his, but anyway, I took these images in London and Liverpool. And I was born in London, but now live in the sticks. So when I visit the city, I act like a tourist and see what I can photograph. And I really enjoy this high contrast, black and white treatment and finding buildings where it will work. So is there an urban location near you that might inspire your next project? So travel is, of course, another potential source of inspiration for a project. I spent a week touring the Pembrokeshire coast, and it was a journey I was looking forward to because the southwest corner of Wales was a part of Britain I'd never visited. And another draw for me is that Pembrokeshire is relatively under-photographed. I took the opportunity to fly my drone, which always provides views of the landscape that are different from what you see with your camera on a tripod. So taking a holiday, that might be just the inspiration you need for a project. Oh, and in this month's RPS Landscape magazine, this one here, there's an article inside that you'll find by Steve Hartley describing a trip to Dingle in Ireland. I was one of the photographers on that trip. And this mini project shows some intimate landscape views I took on that trip. And in this collection, I decided to focus on lines in the landscape. So if you're suffering from photographer's block, a short trip somewhere, that might be the inspiration you need. And a workshop is another source of inspiration. I took these images in the small town of Pellestrina near Venice. So to travel from Venice to Pellestrina, you take a 20-minute boat ride to Lido, then you take a 40-minute bus ride to Pellestrina, and at one point the bus gets on a ferry to cross from one island to another. It's quite a journey, and I would never have found it if I wasn't on a workshop run by Colin Jarvis. So you could try a workshop to inspire you. The RPS offer several. And this project arose from another workshop. This was an RPS workshop on ecological and experimental photography run by Elizabeth Woodger. And the aim of the workshop was to explore alternative and innovative approaches to addressing ecological issues. And working with Elizabeth, I came up with the idea of fossils of the Anthropocene. So it's a series of cyanotype photograms made from obsolete cables. So like most people, I have a drawer full of old cables, chargers, leads, adapters that no longer fit anything that I own. And these cables may have a short shelf life, but their plastic and metal components will end up in the ground as part of the fossil record. Future layers of rock will carry the imprint of my technology choices. Now, in the same way that these cables have been left behind by new devices, cyanotype is an early photographic process that's been left behind by modern photography. So I thought they were made for each other. And the cyanotypes show the cables and connectors as kind of ghostly white shapes. I think some of them look like undersea creatures, as if they've evolved into some strange new life form. And then, when you do a variety of projects, like Jean said, they begin to breed. So this is my submission for a fellowship panel. As you can see, I can go beyond 6 images when I have to. And I'm probably tempting fate in showing you this. The panel may well crash and burn. I will let you know in June after my assessment. But I wanted to show it to you because it's another example of how projects come about. The fossils of the Anthropocene idea taught me about cyanotypes. I spent a while perfecting the process, and then I combined it with the architectural photographs I'd taken in London over several years. And the first few prints seemed to work. So then I visited London on some dedicated photography trips to complete the panel. And all of these buildings kind of started as blueprints. So the cyanotype idea tied it all together. And this is another example of being surprised by the process. You'll remember that the pinhole photographs I showed you look quite sharp for a lensless technology. And these cyanotypes are the same. I mean, other cyanotypes I'd seen in the past were like my fossils of the Anthropocene, basically blue and white with no shades in between. But I worked on a different chemistry and I found I could get prints that are comparable to what you get off an inkjet printer. They are beautiful. So combining two different ideas can sometimes yield a new idea that's totally different from the other two. It's like smashing together atoms in a particle collider. And I wanted to end on a short parable, and I thought I'd use this parable as an excuse to show you a final project I did with my father-in-law, who's a ceramicist. So like most parables, this one varies in the telling, but it goes a little something like this. On the first day of pottery class, the ceramics teacher announced that the class would be divided into two groups. He told the first group to spend 30 days creating one perfect pot. Meanwhile, he told the second group to make one pot per day for 30 days. So which group do you think made the best quality pots? On the final day of class, the students brought their pots in for grading, and an external examiner went around assessing each of the pots. To the surprise of the whole class, all the best pots came from the second group, the group that was instructed to create one pot per day. Now, why might this be? So imagine that you were a student who spent 30 days on one pot. You'd probably spend your time thinking and planning and following one idea, and you're aiming for perfection. And now imagine you're a student in the other group. You don't have time for perfection. You need to get to work. So without the pressure of perfection, it's likely you're going to experiment and try out different techniques. It doesn't matter if you fail, because tomorrow there'll be a new pot. And students that needed to create 30 pots, they got better and more confident and more courageous by doing, not by doing well, but just by doing. And it reminds me of this quotation from the artist Chuck Close. Inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just show up and get to work. If you wait around for the clouds to part and a bolt of lightning to strike you in the brain, you are not going to make an awful lot of work. All the best ideas come out of the process. They come out of the work itself. So before diving into that associateship or fellowship or book project or exhibition or AV or whatever, remember the parable of the pottery glass. So my suggestion is to try out lots of 6-image projects rather than spend your time worrying how to make the perfect project. I mean, one of those 6-image projects will grow and lead to something else. So I only had a chance to talk about a few of my projects today, but if you'd like to see more, you'll find them on my website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was quite exhausting. You've certainly got a lot of examples there. So have we got any more questions from anybody? No. As I say, if you aren't sure whether you signed up, the only reason you wouldn't have got, if you have signed up, the only reason you wouldn't have got an email is if you only did it since about 2 o'clock yesterday, because the lists were downloaded and sent to me 2 o'clock yesterday, and you will have already received an email with the link for today on that. But if there's anybody else, when you've checked your emails that's confused, just send me an email and I'll get it checked for you.
Can I just ask there, Jean? I'm certain that I haven't signed up and I haven't paid anything. I'm just wondering where I need to go to get signed up.
If you go to the Landscape Group website on the RPS website,
Yes.
when you log in, it says projects, and I think we're the top project. I'm not sure, but if you go down the projects, it says project, and you can book in there.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? In that case, I would just like to thank Mark and David very much for their inspiring contributions, and I hope everybody feels inspired to start thinking about a project. So we've got a month before the next talk, and hopefully people will have a little bit of a think in that time and start experimenting, or by all means start with a 6-picture project, or just go out with your camera and find what you like taking pictures of.
Jean, there was a question in the chat from Colin Stubbs. Can you explain a bit more about how you collect project ideas, how you collect ideas? So I know that I'm down to give a talk to do with technologies. Is that right? Or to do with project management and so on.
You are.
And what I was going to do in that talk was talk about that process of collecting them. I use an application called Notion, and I'll be explaining how I use that in order to collect those ideas together.
Absolutely. So that will all be covered in a later session. Any other questions? If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, that's fine. No, in that case, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. And if there's any questions, feel free to email me. And if they're for Mark or David, I'll pass them on.
Thank you.